She buried her husband on a Tuesday morning in March of 1346, and by Wednesday afternoon, soldiers were at her door demanding taxes she could not pay. Her name was Marjorie, a widow at 32 with 4 children under the age of 10, living in a village so small it did not appear on any map. Her husband had been a tenant farmer, killed in a skirmish between rival lords, a war that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with men he had never met. Marjorie stood in the doorway of her cottage, dirt still under her fingernails from digging his grave, and looked into the eyes of the tax collector. He was not cruel. He was not kind. He was simply doing his job, and his job was to take what little she had left. That night, after he rode away with her last sack of grain, Marjorie sat by the fire and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not beg. She would not remarry out of desperation. She would survive, and she would teach her children to do the same. This is not the history of kings and castles. This is the history of widows and orphans, of poor families who lived through wars they did not start and could not stop. This is the story of how ordinary people, left behind by dead husbands and absent lords, found ways to endure in a world that offered them no safety, no justice, and no mercy. These are the forgotten survivors, the ones who stitched together survival from scraps, who turned weakness into strategy, and who carried the weight of entire communities on shoulders that should never have had to bear it. Welcome to English Mindset, where we step into the lives of the people history overlooks, the ones whose names were never written, but whose resilience shaped the world we live in today. Today, we walk beside medieval widows and poor families as they navigate war, famine, invasion, and loss. We will see what they saw, feel what they felt, and learn what it really takes to survive when you have nothing and no one is coming to save you. If you have ever wondered what courage looks like when it has no audience, when it is not celebrated or rewarded, just quietly, desperately necessary, stay with me. Because these stories will break your heart and rebuild it stronger. Medieval Europe was a constant state of war. Feudal lords fought over land, kings fought over crowns, the church fought over souls, and caught in the middle were millions of ordinary people, farmers, laborers, craftsmen, who had no say in the conflicts, but bore all the consequences. When armies marched, they destroyed crops. When cities were besieged, civilians starved. When territories changed hands, taxes doubled or tripled overnight. And when men went to war, whether as conscripts or volunteers, their families were left behind, vulnerable, unprotected, and expected to survive on their own. For widows, survival was especially brutal. Under medieval law, a woman's legal identity was tied to her husband. When he died, she often lost access to land, to income, to protection. If she had sons old enough to inherit, she might retain some security. But if her children were young, or if she had only daughters, she could be evicted, disinherited, or forced into remarriage by relatives or lords who wanted control of her late husband's property. She had few legal rights, little economic power, and no political voice. And yet, thousands of medieval widows not only survived, but found ways to thrive, to protect their children, and to carve out spaces of autonomy in a world designed to erase them. Marjorie, the widow who lost her husband in 1346, was one of them. After the tax collector took her grain, she had nothing left to feed her children through the winter. She could have given up. She could have sent her children to relatives or to the church. But she refused. Instead, she walked to the nearest town, found a wool merchant, and offered to spin thread for him. She had no spinning wheel, so she borrowed one from a neighbor in exchange for a share of her earnings. She worked from dawn until her fingers bled, spinning wool into thread, thread into pennies, pennies into survival. It was not enough to live comfortably, but it was enough to keep her children alive. And that was all that mattered. Marjorie's story was repeated across medieval Europe. Widows became spinners, weavers, brewers, bakers, laundresses, anything that allowed them to earn a small income while staying close to home and children. These were not careers. They were survival strategies, and they required not just skill, but endurance, resourcefulness, and an unshakable determination to keep going when every system was stacked against them. If this story is gripping you, if you are starting to see the incredible strength it took just to survive as a woman in the medieval world, then let me ask you something. What would you have done in Marjorie's place? Would you have had the strength to keep going, or would the weight have crushed you? Think about it. And if this question makes you realize how much we take for granted, how much security and choice we have that medieval women did not, then you are beginning to understand what survival really cost. Not all widows had Marjorie's options. In some regions, especially during invasions, widows were targeted. Invading armies, whether Mongols sweeping across Eastern Europe or English forces raiding France during the 100 Years' War, saw women and children as easy prey. They looted homes, seized livestock, and took women as captives or worse. Widows, with no men to defend them, were especially vulnerable. And so they developed strategies of invisibility, of deception, of making themselves as unremarkable and worthless looking as possible. In a village in what is now Poland, a widow named Zofia hid her children in a root cellar every time word came of approaching soldiers. She dressed in rags, smeared her face with dirt, and left her cottage door open to make it look like it had already been looted. When soldiers came through, they glanced at her hovel, saw nothing of value, and moved on. Zofia's survival depended on appearing to have nothing, on being invisible. And it worked, not because it was glamorous or heroic, but because it was smart. Zofia's tactic of invisibility was common. Women hid valuables in wells, in graves, in animal pens. They buried grain in the forest. They disguised daughters as boys. They aged themselves with ash and soot. They became experts in the art of looking poor, even if they had managed to save a little. Because in a world where wealth drew violence, poverty was protection. Another survival strategy was community. Poor families and widows could not survive alone, so they banded together. They shared resources, pooled labor, and protected each other. In many villages, women formed informal networks, helping each other with childcare, with work, with defense. These were not official organizations, they were born of necessity. But they were powerful. In a village in southern France during the 100 Years' War, a group of widows organized themselves into a cooperative. They pooled their resources to buy a communal oven, which they used to bake bread not just for themselves, but to sell in the market. The profits were divided equally. It was not much, but it was enough to keep their families fed. And more importantly, it gave them bargaining power, a collective voice that individual women would never have had. This model of mutual aid, of women supporting women, was one of the most important survival mechanisms in the medieval world. It was not romanticized, it was not celebrated, but it was real and it worked. Let me ask you something. In your own life, when have you relied on community to survive? When have you been part of something bigger than yourself that kept you afloat? Drop a comment and tell me, because I want to know. What does mutual aid look like in your world? Children too had to adapt. In poor families, children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to work. They tended animals, hauled water, gleaned fields after harvest, foraged for firewood, and begged when necessary. Childhood, as we understand it, did not exist for the poor. Survival was a family effort, and everyone contributed. In a village in England during the 1370s, a boy named Thomas, orphaned at age 8, survived by working as a goose boy. He was paid in food scraps and a place to sleep in the barn. It was not a childhood, it was labor, but it kept him alive. And when he was old enough, he apprenticed to a carpenter, learned a trade, and eventually built a life. His survival was not guaranteed, but he fought for it one day at a time. Thomas's story is a reminder that survival in the medieval world was not passive. It was active, relentless, exhausting. It required making hard choices, accepting grim realities, and continuing to move forward, even when hope was thin. There were also moments of extraordinary kindness. Monasteries and convents often took in widows and orphans, offering food, shelter, and work. Monks and nuns were not always benevolent, and some institutions exploited the labor of the desperate. But many genuinely tried to help, to provide a safety net in a world that had none. A widow named Beatrice, living in what is now Belgium, lost her husband and her home during a siege. She walked with her 3 children to a nearby convent and begged for refuge. The nuns took them in, gave them a room, and allowed Beatrice to work in the convent's laundry in exchange for food and shelter. It was hard work. It was not freedom, but it was survival. And it was better than the alternative. Beatrice's story highlights the role of the church as a social institution. For all its flaws, the medieval church often functioned as the only organized form of charity, the only place the destitute could turn when everything else failed. But the church could not help everyone. And for many poor families, survival meant migration. When local conditions became unbearable, when war or famine or disease made staying impossible, people left. They walked to other villages, to towns, to cities, searching for work, for safety, for a chance. These migrations were dangerous, chaotic, and often tragic. But they were also acts of hope, desperate assertions that somewhere, somehow, life could be better. In the wake of the Black Death in the 1350s, which killed 1/3 of Europe's population, labor became scarce. And for the first time in centuries, poor families had bargaining power. Widows and orphans could demand higher wages. Peasants could negotiate better terms with landlords. It was a grim silver lining to an apocalyptic tragedy, but it was real. Survival, for many, became slightly less impossible. A widow named Agnes, living in England after the plague, refused to remarry and instead demanded payment for her labor as a field worker. Before the plague, she would have been forced to accept whatever pittance her lord offered. But now, with so few workers, she could say no. She could negotiate. And she did. She earned enough to rent her own cottage, to support her daughter, and to live independently. It was not wealth, but it was autonomy. And that was revolutionary. Agnes's story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, circumstances can shift. Systems that seem permanent can crack. And when they do, the people who have been surviving in the margins can sometimes seize new opportunities. But not everyone benefited. Not every widow found work. Not every orphan found a home. The historical record is full of heartbreak, of women and children who simply disappeared, whose fates were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged. Survival was not guaranteed. It was a lottery of geography, timing, luck, and the kindness or cruelty of strangers. If you are still with me, if these stories are hitting deep, then let me ask you to do something. If you believe these voices, these forgotten acts of endurance, deserve to be heard, hit the like button. Not because I am asking, but because history should honor not just the victors, but the survivors. And if you want to keep exploring the truths that history buries, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications. Because we are building something here. A space where the forgotten are remembered. Another survival tactic was remarriage, though it was often more strategic than romantic. A widow with children and no income was a burden to herself and her community. But a widow who remarried gained protection, resources, and legal standing. Many widows remarried quickly, not out of love, but out of necessity. And many of those marriages were to men who were themselves desperate older men, widowers, laborers looking for someone to manage their households. In a village in Germany, a widow named Greta remarried within 3 months of her husband's death. Her new husband was 20 years older, a blacksmith with grown children. It was not a love match, but it was a partnership. Greta cooked and managed the household. The blacksmith provided income and protection. They survived together, bound not by affection but by mutual need. Greta's story raises uncomfortable questions. Is survival worth the cost if it means sacrificing autonomy, choice, and even happiness? And yet, who are we to judge the choices people made when the alternative was starvation or death? Children orphaned by war often faced even grimmer fates. Some were taken in by relatives. Some were sent to monasteries or convents. Some were apprenticed to craftsmen. And some simply wandered, begging, stealing, surviving however they could. Medieval cities were full of orphaned children, living in the streets, vulnerable to exploitation, disease, and violence. In Paris, during the 1420s, during the chaos of the 100 Years' War, a girl named Jeanne, orphaned at age 9, survived by begging near the cathedral. She slept in doorways, ate scraps, and avoided the gangs of older street children who preyed on the young. A baker's wife eventually took pity on her and gave her work, sweeping the shop in exchange for bread. Jeanne never learned to read. She never had a family of her own. But she survived, and that, in itself, was an achievement. Jeanne's story is a reminder that survival is not always triumphant. Sometimes it is just endurance. Sometimes it is living one more day and then another, with no promise of anything better. Another strategy was faith. For many medieval people, especially the poor, religion was not just spiritual comfort. It was a framework for understanding suffering, for finding meaning in loss, and for maintaining hope when the material world offered none. Widows and orphans prayed not just for salvation, but for daily bread, for protection, for the strength to keep going. And that faith, however we understand it today, was real and powerful to them. A widow named Catherine, living in Italy during the 1380s, lost her husband and 2 of her 3 children to plague. She had every reason to despair, but she did not. She believed that God had a purpose for her suffering, that her survival meant something. She joined a lay religious order, cared for other plague victims, and lived the rest of her life in service. It was not a happy life, but it was a purposeful one, and that gave her the strength to endure. Catherine's story raises a question. What keeps you going when everything is taken from you? Is it faith? Is it love? Is it stubbornness? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know. What do you think sustained these people through unimaginable loss? Let me bring this into the present, because the lessons from medieval widows and poor families are not locked in the past. They speak to us now. We live in a world where systems can fail, where war and disaster can upend lives overnight, where the vulnerable are still the first to suffer. And when those moments come, the people who survive are not the ones with the most money or the highest status. They are the ones with resilience, with community, with resourcefulness, with the refusal to give up. So what does that mean for us? It means we should build networks of mutual aid. It means we should develop practical skills. It means we should not take stability for granted. It means we should honor the survivors, learn from their strategies, and carry their resilience forward. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about survival, about community, about what it takes to endure when the world falls apart, then I need you to share this video. Not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because these lessons matter. These stories matter, and the more people who hear them, the stronger we all become. Let me end with one final story. There was a widow, name unknown, who lived in a village that was burned 3 times during a war between rival lords. Each time she rebuilt. Each time she planted her garden, repaired her cottage, and kept going. She had no husband, no sons, no wealth. Just the stubborn belief that tomorrow would come and she would face it. She lived to be 70, an extraordinary age for a medieval peasant woman. And when she died, the village women buried her with honor, not because she was powerful, but because she had survived. And survival in that world was the highest form of strength. Thank you for walking through this history with me. Thank you for honoring these voices. If this video gave you something, hit the like button. If you want to keep exploring the truths that history reveals, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications. Because we are building something here. A space where the past teaches us how to face the future. I will see you in the next story.